Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. Lovely to see so many of you here. Thank you for braving the elements to get to Kendal today. I'm Sheila McGregor, and I'm the director of Axis, which, as I'm sure some of you will know, is an organisation that gives artists an online profile. It's a platform on which artists can promote their practice. But I was, not so very long ago, also a curator. In fact, for most of my career, really, I've been a curator, and I've had responsibility for museums as well as for art galleries. In my last salaried post in Walsall, where I was manager of museums and galleries, I had responsibility for the Jerome K. Jerome Birthplace Museum and the Walsall Leather Museum, which often caused a raised eyebrow. And I've experienced many different sizes of institutions. So the largest local authority museum service in England, which is Birmingham, where I was a curator in the art department for a few years. But I've also worked in very small places as well. So I know what it's like to have responsibility for a collection, and I also know how rewarding and absolutely revelatory it can be when you let an artist loose in your collection. I started off when I was thinking about today with a rather kind of didactic PowerPoint presentation with a lot of bullet points, and then at a certain stage, it just didn't feel quite right, so I abandoned that, and I've opted instead for something that's much more image-led and probably a little bit more stream of consciousness, and I hope more stimulating. What I wanted first of all to do is to make a number of sort of philosophical points, if you like, about artists and collections and the importance of the visual imagination. I think the thing that has always struck me about artists is their curiosity. They do have a way of seeing that has the potential to be very creative and constructive. 50 years ago, the novelist and scientist C.P. Snow argued in a famous lecture that Western society was separated by, or dominated by, two cultures, science and the humanities. And he took the view that this sort of separation of the arts and humanities on the one hand and science on the other would prove a fatal impediment to progress, to social and economic progress. And I think it is still very much the case that we have these two cultures in separate places, certainly within our education system. You know, you either opt for the arts and humanities or you opt for a more scientific route. But the visual imagination, you know, the ability to imagine and visualize what might be, is a resource that really cuts across all fields of human endeavour. And no artist illustrates this point so well as Leonardo da Vinci, who was extremely interested in mathematics. He designed aqueducts and bridges. He investigated magnetic attraction, anatomy, the circulation of the bloodstream, and steam as a locomotive power. And he even developed a prototype for a motor car. And of course, the thing he used to investigate these different things was drawing. And for Leonardo, drawing was a way of knowing and of understanding the world and working out how things might work. The other historical figure who sprang to mind as I was thinking about today was, of course, John Ruskin. another polymath who was interested in geology and botany, but also in architecture and the great art of the past. Ilana might tell me what this is.
No, but it could be a wee layer of mica in the middle.
Could be a layer of mica in the middle, yes. Anyway, as you can tell, plundered off the internet, and I couldn't actually find out exactly what the drawing was or where it is held, but it's a fairly kind of typical Ruskin watercolour of a geological specimen. And Ruskin too used drawing as a way of recording what he saw and understanding what he saw. He wrote a book called The Elements of Drawing, which was published in 1857. And he was sort of very interested also in the idea of museums as a resource for the widest possible cross-section of society, a place where people could encounter objects and learn about them and broaden their horizons. He established a museum for the working men of Sheffield, which is still there actually, and his collection is on show in the Millennium Galleries in Sheffield, where you can see a large collection of artworks, minerals, geological specimens, medieval manuscripts, and many other precious items. Now, this is somebody you probably won't necessarily know about. I've only very recently discovered this curator, Alexander Dorner, who lived from 1893 to 1957 and who was a pioneer of new approaches to interpretation and display. As the director of the Landesmuseum, or the State Museum in Hanover in Germany, in the, I think, the 1920s and 1930s, he not only collected avant-garde contemporary art, but he also designed displays in which art was juxtaposed with other objects from different periods to create an immersive experiential environment. And he continued this approach as director of the Art Museum at the Rhode Island School of Design after fleeing Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. And there he replaced the traditional displays with dramatic installations that had a much broader public appeal. And he actually referred to the museum as a Kraftwerk, or power station. So a place where a kind of laboratory of ideas, a place where kind of powerful relationships and experiences could be generated. And I include him in this presentation really just to make the point that museum and gallery curators, just as much as artists, are constantly looking for new ways of doing things. You know, there's absolutely nothing new about the desire to unsettle the status quo, to sort of shake things up. And nor, indeed, is there anything terribly new about our current preoccupation with the audience experience. You know, it happened long ago. I think we often have a tendency, don't we, to kind of caricature the past and to view the present as somehow much more innovative than it really is. So moving on to some really sort of significant artists' interventions in museums. This is the wrapping of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago in 1969, I think, by Christo and his partner Jean-Claude, who became very famous for wrapping buildings, including the Reichstag in Berlin. And I suppose you could say that in the end this gesture became a bit formulaic. But certainly when it first happened, and I think I'm right in saying, I could be wrong, but I think I'm right in saying this was really the first time they did it. It was very much conceived as a gesture, as an intervention in opposition to the institutions of the art world, as a way of making the role of the museum in containing and by implication constraining artistic expression absolutely manifest. So, and of course the other thing about this kind of work is that it's no longer an art object, it's a one-off process or event, and it can't therefore be commodified or collected. It can be documented photographically, but that's about all. So interventions like this really made museums doubt the very premise of their own existence, which is of course all about housing objects. Even if, paradoxically, this kind of work or intervention could only be carried out with the permission of the very institution that the artist was seeking to criticise. And of course, the thing about a process like this, and I'm sure Ilana and Helen will talk about this as well, is that it involves an awful lot of conversation, a great deal of negotiation, a great deal of argument, compromise. I think they got into terrible trouble with the fire department in Chicago, who were very worried about the fabric, you know, was it fireproof? And in fact, I think the whole situation led to the resignation of the museum's director. So we hope that nothing that comes out of today's event will lead to anything quite so dramatic as that. Another significant exhibition, a landmark exhibition, because this was about the artist not as a kind of agent provocateur, but as a curator and a collector who is given license to select, group and label objects as they see fit, blurring categories in the process and crossing the boundaries that normally keep museum disciplines apart. So this was at the Museum of Mankind in London in 1986, Eduardo Palazzi's Lost Magic Kingdoms. After months of research in the museum stores, Palazzi grouped together items such as Eskimo ivories, Aboriginal paintings on bark, a reaping knife, a Peruvian pottery trumpet, an elephant mask from the Cameroons, raw hide playing cards, a camel saddle, some Maori household gods, alongside work that he had created himself. Now, I suppose this could be criticised as a latter-day exercise in colonial appropriation, but I'm quite sure that Palazzi himself would have argued that there was a kind of egalitarianism implicit in his approach. In other words, he was asserting the aesthetic value of these tribal objects and proclaiming his own kinship with the artists who had made them. Just a few years later, another very significant artist's intervention was Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum project at the Maryland Historical Society, which took place in 1992 to 93, and which highlighted the history of Native and African Americans in Maryland. And of course, Fred Wilson is himself an African-American artist. And this was probably, in a way, a more significant intervention than Palazzi's because it was so politically charged. And what Fred Wilson did was lay bare the spurious neutrality of the museum and make curators more aware of the responsibilities they have when they put an object on public display. So, for example, Wilson placed a Ku Klux Klan hood inside an Edwardian-era baby carriage. And he juxtaposed a group of ornate 19th century chairs with a whipping post used to hold slaves for beating. Interestingly, it was working in the education department at the Met in New York and at the Museum of Natural History that got Fred Wilson interested in what wasn't being shown to the public. So what he was doing with this project was drawing attention to the gaps and the silences in museum display, thereby calling into question the museum's credentials as a source of dispassionate and authoritative expert knowledge. And I'm quite sure again that Ilana and Helen will talk about the experience of delving into the museum store and some of the, sort of very extraordinary and sometimes very troubling things that are to be found there. Another extraordinary artist's intervention in a museum, Sophie Karl's exhibition The Appointment at the Freud Museum in London in 1999. And this was an exhibition curated by somebody called James Putnam, whom you may have come across. He was a curator of Egyptology at the British Museum, and he has become something of a pioneer in commissioning artists to work with collections. And he has, in fact, written a book about this, which is on the reading list in your information pack. And he curated this exhibition by Sophie Karl at the Freud Museum. Ralph Rugoff, the director of the Hayward Gallery, has said of this exhibition, "It's hard to think of many contemporary artists whom Sigmund Freud would have welcomed into his cosy Hampstead Museum, but Sophie Karl would have to top the list. Composed from photos, objects, and brief texts, her art often suggests extracts from a quirky case history. But whether chronicling eroticized childhood memories or an adult sex life in which fact and fiction merge, Karl reveals more about the wayward workings of desire than almost any artist or analyst of her generation. But unlike the studied sobriety of the museum's displays, Karl's works strike a feverishly sexy note. Printed on hot pink cards, her concise, caption-like narratives tell of stolen love letters, shoplifted red shoes, and her wedding in a drive-through chapel in Las Vegas. It's a wonderfully unnerving tale, conflating images of innocence, sexuality, family, and voyeurism. Not unlike the father of psychoanalysis, Karl is first and foremost a storyteller. Mark Dion, another artist who springs immediately to mind when we consider the subject of artists working with collections. This is an image of an exhibition of his recent work in Berlin last year. So not a museum intervention, but I've chosen it to exemplify what you might call the museum effect in contemporary art, which is a tendency to employ and, perhaps even on occasion parody the traditional taxonomic museum display. And what you might call the archival impulse in contemporary art is very, very strong. I don't know if anybody in this room went to Documenta in Kassel, Germany last year, but there was a great deal of work on show there that was basically kind of built around the idea of the archive. And on the whole, this impulse is not ironic imitation, but instead reflects a genuine impulse to collect, to label, to organise, to investigate an idea, an intellectual process or a natural phenomenon by a process of iterative, cumulative representation and display. And Mark Dion has exhibited his work all over the world, but was also part of the Alchemy project at Manchester Museum, which, Ilana contributed to. So my last image, and I thought it was quite important just to choose something that's absolutely topical, current. This is from an exhibition currently showing at the collection in Lincoln, curated by Tom Morton and entitled the world is almost 6,000 years old, which is apparently a quotation from Shakespeare's As You Like It. The exhibition itself brings together objects from the county of Lincolnshire's archaeological holdings with works by over 20 emerging and established contemporary artists. I haven't seen the exhibition myself, but according to the press release on the website, it's about, at its centre is a critical awareness of the mutability of the material record, and of how objects may be mobilised to speak of multiple histories. So I would love to go and see it myself, and perhaps some of us will. This particular piece is entitled Self-Portrait as a Drowned Man, by an artist called Jeremy Miller, and it is apparently a sort of reprise of an 1840 photograph by Hippolyte Bayard, in which he shows himself as a drowned man. And I've no idea what the work's about, but it's a very extraordinary image, and I just sort of wanted to end with something that is absolutely of the moment.